Mark 16, Return to the Sea. The late afternoon sun filtered through the leaded glass windows of Pastor Arthur's study, warming the rows of leather-bound commentaries and casting a soft glow over the 7 men and women gathered in a casual circle. Mismatched ceramic mugs rested on the low wooden coffee table. Their steam long since vanished as the final session on the Gospel of Mark reached its peak. Arthur leaned back in his worn mahogany armchair, his fingers lightly tapping the margins of his open Bible. "We've spent months tracking the breathless, urgent pace of this book," Arthur began, his voice grounding the room. "And today, we reach the edge of the cliff." Chapter 16. Let's look closely at the unbroken chain of custody that brings us here. When the male disciples completely scattered in the dark of Gethsemane, it was a quiet community of women who held the line. Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome. They didn't just watch the crucifixion from afar. They tracked the body to the tomb on Friday evening, auditing the exact coordinates so there would be zero ambiguity. And the moment the Sabbath restrictions lift at dawn, they are back with legal spices to perform the final somatic care for their teacher. Sarah adjusted her position on the sofa, her finger tracing the text of verse 8. "But it ends so strangely here," she murmured, looking across at Arthur with a flicker of vulnerability. The young man in the white robe tells them he is risen, and then verse 8 says they fled from the tomb trembling and astonished, and they said nothing to anyone for they were afraid. Growing up, I was always taught that the Great Commission was the clean, triumphant ending. Finding out that our oldest, most authoritative 4th century manuscripts, like Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus, completely stop right here at verse 8, it feels jarring. It makes me feel a bit unsafe, like a piece of the foundation is loose. Austin leaned forward from his stool, his thumb holding open a notebook filled with scribbled Greek roots. "Sarah, that's exactly where the beauty of the structure actually hides," he said gently, trying to offer a bridge. Think about how scrolls worked in the 1st century. They were horizontal leather or papyrus rolls, wound tightly. The outermost edge and the absolute innermost end suffered the highest exposure to friction, moisture, and tearing. If the original archetype of Mark was a scroll, the final column of text was the most vulnerable leaf in the entire database. Even if it was an early bound book, a codex, the last page was notoriously prone to falling off. If that final page detached before the first copies were made, scribes down the line were forced to stop exactly where the damage occurred, ephobunto gar, for they were afraid. It's a grammatical whiplash. Ending a major biography with the word "for" is incredibly rare and awkward in classical Greek, which heavily supports the mechanical reality that the physical end was lost very early on in Rome. Vince, looking at the text with a corporate attorney's eye for documentation, tapped his pen against his pad. "The internal data completely backs up that hardware failure theory, Austin," Vince noted, his analytical tone sharpening the discussion. "Look at the immediate transition to verse 9. The subject discontinuity is wild. Verse 8 leaves the women running in terror. Verse 9 suddenly introduces Mary Magdalene as if we've never met her before, shifting vocabulary entirely. Scribes in the 2nd century recognized this missing narrative link. They had an urgent pastoral need to repair the damage, so they compiled a summary patch using known, valid apostolic traditions from Luke and John, the appearances in the country, the signs, the ascension, to ensure Mark's gospel didn't terminate in perpetual silence. It doesn't threaten inspiration. It shows a living church preserving the message." Tariq nodded, his mind automatically mapping the explanation into code dependencies. "Exactly, it functions just like a system restore," Tariq intervened. "You have a physical database failure, a torn scroll, and the community deploys a supplementary patch to protect the integrity of the terminal line. But look at the original design before the tear. Verse 7 contains a precise, targeted coordinate. But go, tell his disciples, and Peter, that he is going before you into Galilee. There you will see him." Why Galilee? Jerusalem was the theater of total institutional failure and psychological trauma. The last time we saw Peter, he was weeping in the dark courtyard after a public breakdown. By singling Peter out, the text loops us directly back to the shores of Mark chapter 1, verse 16. Elena smiled, leaning over the table to point at Tariq's Bible. "It's the ultimate macro-inclusio," she said, her real estate mind appreciating a perfect architectural closure. Mark brackets his entire book between two identical geographical markers. The first call to fish for men happens by the Sea of Galilee, and the final resurrection appointment sends them right back to that exact same water. The book forms an intentional, endless circle. If it ended abruptly at verse 8 with the women silent, the narrative engine forces the reader to turn right back to chapter 1 and read it again. It signals that Peter's failure didn't break the covenant. The invitation to follow is still active, but it requires returning to the origin point to undo the denial. Chloe watched the faces around the room, a warm stillness settling over her therapist's perspective. Think about the profound psychological mercy in that geographical reset, Chloe whispered, bringing the weight of the study to a quiet rest. Jesus doesn't demand that they fix themselves in the city that broke them. He meets them back where they first loved him, right in the middle of their ordinary, messy lives as fishermen. A broken text mirrors a broken community, and both are patched by grace. Arthur looked around the circle, seeing the deep, satisfied nods of a group that had wrestled with the raw mechanics of the text and found its heart. He closed his Bible with a quiet, decisive thud. And with that, gentlemen and ladies, our long journey through the Roman Gospel is officially complete. Next week, we turn a fresh page. Let's take a week to think about whether we want to dive into the strategic architecture of the post-exilic prophets like Haggai or move forward into the early church expansion. But tonight, the table is clear and the circle is whole.